Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery video. Today I've got a fascinating yet tragic story for you. A case which largely changed the course of the criminal justice system in the UK and played a major part in the abolition of capital murder here also. The last executions in the UK were by hanging and took place in 1964 before it was finally abolished in 1969 or 1973 in Northern Ireland. Or pretty much completely abolished at least. Although it wasn't used once in this time, it could technically still be used under military jurisdiction up until 1998. And in 2004 it became officially prohibited in all circumstances. And the story I'm going to tell you today of Timothy Evans is kind of responsible for that. He was born in South Wales on the 20th of November 1924 and was abandoned by his father shortly after birth. He had an older sister Eileen and a younger half-sister Maureen, and his mother remarried in September 1933. It wasn't an easy childhood. He struggled to learn to speak and didn't do particularly well in school. This is partially because he was in an accident when he was 8 or 9 years old and developed a sore on his right foot that just never really healed properly, which caused him to have to take regular trips to the hospital and miss long periods of school. As a consequence, by the time he left school, he was pretty much illiterate. He could barely read or even write his own name. This is important to bear in mind for this video. He would often require other people to read out documents and important information to him. And it seems that this inability to read or write led to a feeling of inadequacy because Timothy would become prone to inventing stories about himself and his life in an apparent attempt to boost his self-esteem. He wasn't the most credible person. People just kind of expected Timothy to always be telling some kind of tall tale. Something else that will become important to remember as I tell this story. Timothy's IQ was later tested around 1949 and he was found to have a score of 65 to 75, which would have placed him in the low to below average category today. Back in the 40s, he would have been openly called mentally retarded. In 1935, his mother and her second husband moved the family to London, where Timothy continued to attend school whilst working as a painter and decorator on the side. He didn't much like London, and after a couple of years he tried to return to Wales to work in the coal mines, but due to the issues with his foot, he didn't last very long and was forced to return back to his mother in London. By this point he would have still been in his mid-teens, and so he stays in London. He was known throughout his life to switch between a really thick Welsh accent and a Cockney accent depending on the situation or who he was with. His only run-in with the law in this time would be when he's fined 40 shillings at the West London Magistrates Court for stealing a car and driving without a licence or insurance. Other than that, he was a pretty stand-up citizen. The January of the following year, he would meet Beryl Susanna Thorley on a blind date, and she would go on to become his wife just 9 months later. They initially lived with Timothy's family, but in early 1948, Beryl discovered that she was pregnant. So they decided to move into the top floor flat at 10 Rillington Place in the Ladbroke Grove area of Notting Hill, London. On the 10th of October 1948, their daughter Geraldine Evans was born. This wasn't an easy marriage. Beryl was only 19, Timothy was in his early 20s. They would argue constantly. Occasionally even things would turn physical. Money was one of the main causes of tension between them. Beryl just wasn't that great at managing the family's finances and bills, whilst Timothy spent all of his money on alcohol. Neighbours would hear these blazing rows between them. It very clearly wasn't a happy marriage. It's noted that Timothy would get very violent, especially when he drank, which is why when in late 1949, when Beryl found out that she was pregnant again, the couple were distraught. There was no way they could afford to raise another child, so they considered abortion to be their only option. But of course, abortion was still illegal in the UK at this time, with women having to go to backstreet doctors for help. I couldn't find numbers for the 1950s, but in the 1960s, between 80,000 and 110,000 illegal abortions took place each year in England and Wales. The death rate from these backstreet abortions was twice the maternal mortality rate. Illegal abortions were dangerous and they led to a huge amount of deaths. And illegal abortions are still dangerous today. The same risks are still seen in 2020 in countries which still refuse to legalise them. On November 30th, 1949, Timothy Evans turns up at Merthyr Tydfil police station in Wales. He informs them that his wife has died under unusual circumstances. He said he'd given her some mixture in a bottle that had been provided to him by a man on the street in an attempt to induce an abortion. She'd died as a result of drinking this mixture, and he had disposed of her body by putting it in a drain outside the front of his flat at 10 Rillington Place in London. He says he then arranged for someone to care for his daughter, Geraldine, before heading back to Wales. The police took this really seriously, so they searched and they found nothing, and discovered that the manhole cover was incredibly heavy. It required the strength of 3 police officers to remove it so they could search underneath. There was no way a single man could lift this manhole cover and put a body down there. So he's questioned once again, and this time he changes his story. He says that a neighbour called John Christie had offered to perform an abortion on Beryl. He says he didn't want to say Christie's name in the first place and dob him in, but unknown to Timothy and the authorities at the time, John Christie was a serial killer who murdered at least 8 people, strangling them in his own flat at 10 Rillington Place. This serial killer offered to perform an abortion on Beryl, and Beryl and Timothy weren't sure whether to accept this offer at first, but they didn't have any other options. They didn't have the money nor the means to raise another child. They could barely provide for the one they had. So reluctantly, Beryl decides to go through with the procedure. On the 8th of November, Timothy goes to work for the day as usual, whilst Beryl heads down to Christie's flat in order to go through with the abortion. When Timothy arrives home from work that evening, he's informed by Christie that the abortion had failed and Beryl had died. Christie said that he would dispose of the body down the manhole cover and would arrange for a couple he knew from East Acton to come and look after Geraldine for a while whilst Timothy laid low. Timothy asked to see his daughter, but Christie wouldn't let him. So off he goes back to Wales, where just a number of days later, guilt overcomes him and he heads to the police station to confess. He told the police that he'd put Beryl's body down the manhole cover because that's what Christie said that he was going to do. A further search of 10 Rillington Place following this second confession did turn up Beryl's body and baby Geraldine's in a wash house in the back garden. This wash house was locked, and reportedly the only person who had access to it was John Christie. It was owned by him. Both Beryl and Geraldine had been strangled, and Beryl had been physically assaulted before her death. Her face was covered in bruises. Beryl's body had been wrapped in cloth and a tablecloth, and Geraldine lay beside her. And so the police turned back to Timothy Evans. He's questioned and questioned and questioned, until eventually when asked if he killed his wife and child, he replies yes, before providing a full confession. This is a man with a very low IQ, who didn't complete his education, who could barely read. A man who was known to exaggerate and tell tall tales about his life to make himself feel better. He most likely would have been very overwhelmed and confused with all this questioning, just wanting it to end, and would have been forced to spend 2 days alone in a cell beforehand. All in all, he was told very little about what was actually going on with this investigation. It was later revealed that much of his confession was dictated to him by the investigators, and there was zero forensic evidence to point towards Timothy being guilty at all. Basically, the investigators told him what to say, so he said it. But Timothy had been the one to come into the police station in the first place and confess. I mean, it was clearly him, right? But why would he tell them that he placed Beryl's body in the manhole cover when he didn't? Why would he tell them the wrong cause of death? And then if he was going to try and hide it, why would he leave the bodies in such an obvious place? None of this really seemed to bother the investigators, who saw it as an open and shut case. They had no doubt whatsoever of Timothy Evans' guilt. So he's dragged back to London via Paddington Station and is forced to make a third confession and sign it. A confession that sounded strangely intellectual and professional for a man who could barely read or write. He confessed that he'd strangled Beryl during an argument over money and the unborn baby, and he hid her body in the wash house on November 8th. He said he murdered his daughter 2 days later. The confession was the main thing the police would later use against him in court. Why on earth would an innocent man confess to such a thing? He had to be guilty. The trial began on January 11th, 1950, but he was only tried for the murder of his daughter, not for Beryl. In accordance with legal practices at the time, they could only proceed with a single charge of murder for some reason. He was still charged for Beryl's murder technically, he just wasn't tried for it, and they could bring up Beryl's murder in court to establish Timothy's guilt in Geraldine's murder. At trial, Timothy claimed that John Christie had committed the murders, but John Christie wasn't even considered to be a suspect in this case, despite several run-ins with the law throughout his time, including for violence. He literally assaulted a woman just a couple of years beforehand. In fact, John Christie was made a key witness for the prosecution. He denied everything, saying that he'd never offered to abort Beryl's baby, and he told the court of these violent arguments between Timothy and Beryl. The defence tried to prove that Christie was the murderer using all of his past violence, but apparently he was reformed, and this really impressed the jury. Plus, Christie apparently had zero motive here. Timothy definitely had reason to kill his wife. They had no money and he didn't want another child. John Christie was just their neighbour. The prosecution also used Timothy's past against him, the crazy tales and lies he would tell about his life to anybody who would listen. This wasn't the kind of person you could trust, they said. Everything he said contradicted the last thing he said. He couldn't get his story straight at all. In court, he was just overwhelmed by all the proceedings. He really did a very bad job on the stand. He just fell apart. This blundering man was definitely more likely to be the murderer than the actual criminal who lived downstairs. And it's also very important to bear in mind that one very vital piece of information was not brought up in court. 2 workmen wanted to testify to say that there were no bodies in the wash house when they came to do some work in there several days after this alleged murder. By the point that these men would have been in this wash house doing work, Timothy would have already been in Wales. They said they worked in there on the 11th of November and stored their tools in there before clearing out completely before they left. If there was a body in there, they would have seen it. But they were never called to give evidence, and the police actually ended up re-interviewing them and forcing them to change their evidence. The trial ended up lasting just 3 days, and the jury really didn't need much convincing of his guilt, coming to their decision in just 40 minutes. They returned a guilty verdict and sentenced him to death. His team appealed, but he was denied, and so he was hanged on the 9th of March 1950 at Pentonville Prison. And that was that. Justice had been served. Timothy Evans had been rightly put to death. Or so everyone thought, until March 1953. John Christie moves out of 10 Rillington Place and starts illegally subletting his flat out to this couple he knew, charging them the equivalent of £250 a month. One evening, the landlord visits, and upon finding this couple there instead of Christie, immediately kicks them out. The landlord then talks to another tenant living in the building and gives this person permission to use the kitchen in Christie's flat. So this neighbour heads down and attempts to insert brackets into the walls to hold a wireless radio, but notices immediately that something is amiss. He peels back the wallpaper and discovers the bodies of 3 people behind the wall. He calls the police and a search for John Christie immediately begins. He's arrested on the embankment near Putney Bridge on the morning of March 31st. Of course, he's questioned and almost immediately admits the murders of the woman found in his kitchen and the murder of his wife, who would eventually be found under the floorboards in the front room, along with 2 others. A search of the garden found 2 more bodies buried in shallow graves, even a human thigh bone propping up one of the fence posts. They've been there for years, blatant, as clear as day. If the police had done a proper search of the garden 3 years earlier when they were looking for Beryl and Geraldine, Timothy Evans may have been spared. And then John Christie confessed to the murder of Beryl Evans, although he always remained very cagey about the death of Geraldine. I mean, he's a serial killer, he will kill adults, but apparently children are just a little bit too far. John Christie was only tried for the murder of his wife for the same reason that Timothy was only tried for the murder of Geraldine. And of course, he was found guilty and consequently hanged on the 15th of July 1953 at Pentonville Prison by Albert Pierrepoint, just as Timothy Evans had been 3 years earlier. Christie's conviction raised some very obvious doubts about Timothy's guilt in the murder of his wife and daughter. So the Home Secretary at the time commissioned an inquiry to investigate the possibility of a miscarriage of justice. Just a possibility. But amazingly, the inquiry found that it upheld Timothy's guilt in both murders, saying that Christie's confession was unreliable. The Home Secretary backed this up by saying that Timothy mentioned things in a confession that only the killer would know, that he had to be guilty. But as we've already established, it seems like his entire confession was fed to him by the investigators. In fact, an inspector came forward to say that he knows the investigator told Timothy to say these things. In this time, Timothy's mother had requested her son's remains, saying she wanted to intern them in ground consecrated by her church, but she was denied them because they were still insisting that he was guilty, and so his body had to remain in the prison walls. But Timothy's sister was not about to give up, and along with a journalist called Ludovic Kennedy, who wrote this scathing expose on the case, they started a campaign to overturn the conviction. They didn't manage to force another inquiry until 1965, which ended up lasting 32 days. In conclusion, High Court Judge Sir Daniel Brabin found that it was more probable than not that Timothy had murdered his wife, but not his daughter, which was contrary to the prosecution's case, which said that both murders had been committed by the same person as a single act. Plus, Timothy wasn't even tried for the murder of his wife, only his daughter. How could it be possible that he'd be guilty for one, but not both? Especially when the bodies were found next to each other, murdered in the same way. The judge basically went out of his way to lean towards the police evidence wherever possible instead of taking an unbiased look at the case, which is the entire point of an inquiry, but at least this was a start. This same judge also thought that it was more probable than not that Christy killed Geraldine, saying it was a killing in cold blood, which Christy would be more likely to do. So how does any of this make sense? Because of this, years later, the new Home Secretary recommended a royal pardon for Evans, which was granted in 1966, and so he was reburied at St Patrick's Roman Catholic Church in Leytonstone. Even by the time that Timothy was convicted, there was already an outcry over the death penalty in the UK. The question had been raised in Parliament, the public felt very uncomfortable with it, so by the time that 1966 came around and Timothy was found to be pretty much innocent, he was pardoned, people were really fighting against it. There was such an upset over Timothy being pardoned. This seemingly innocent man was put to death for no reason. And this was one of the leading cases that contributed to the abolition of capital punishment in Britain. People didn't want this to happen again. Technically, Beryl and Geraldine's murders remain unsolved to this day, but we can probably all agree that John Christie was most likely the culprit. Even if Timothy Evans was responsible for the murders of his family, there was absolutely no evidence to sentence him to death. There probably wasn't even enough evidence to send him to prison. It's shocking how unwilling the British justice system were to admit that they'd messed up here, and I can say I'm pretty glad that we no longer have the death sentence. I can only imagine the amount of people that have been forcibly put to death over the years. Timothy's story led to such an outcry that the government had no choice but to get rid of it, and I think it was probably rightly so. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm really sorry if I've sounded a little bit bunged up in this. I've got a cold, you'll probably be able to tell. I probably should have said that at the beginning of the video, but here we are now, so sorry if I sound a bit gross, but I wanted to tell the story for you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.